welcome to this event. It looks like we're starting to get plenty of people online, so I will kick the event off. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome and thank you to everyone for joining us today. My name is Philip Wood. I'm president of the British New Zealand Business Association, and I'm delighted to be bringing you this event today, together with our partners, New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, UK Department for International Trade, and one of our major members and supporters, the law firm MinterEllisonRuddWatts. So thank you to all of them. Also, thank you to the panelists for today for giving up their time, and our moderator. Now, in a moment, I am going to pass over to our moderator, Sarah Salmond from MinterEllison. But first of all, I'll just let you know, format for today's event, very simple. We're going to hear from each of our panelists in turn on their perspective of the supply chain, where they see it from where they sit in the process. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers, Q&A, and Sarah will moderate that. This obviously is a great opportunity to ask whatever questions you want to ask. A lot of knowledge sitting on this panel. So please do ask your questions. To do that, you just need to go on the Q&A tab and put it in there. The panelists and Sarah will see it and pick it up and then be able to ask that question and get it answered. Now, I also just need to let you know, we are recording this event. We will then post that link on our website and other social media. So if you want to revisit what was said, you will be able to do that. So we'll post that shortly after the event finishes. So at that point, I think I'll pass over to Sarah Salmond now from MinterEllison, and Sarah will run things from here on in. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Phil, and hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to this BNZBA discussion about New Zealand's current supply chain challenges, and I think importantly, what does the future look like and what can we do to try and deal with the challenges that we face. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Sarah Salmond. I'm a partner at MinterEllisonRuddWatts, specialising in public, regulatory and international trade law. I'd just like to firstly thank our panellists for today, who are all extremely busy. Thank you so much for giving up your time. And also to our great audience for joining us today. Phil assures me we have 96 people on the call today representing the full breadth of businesses and individuals affected by supply chain challenges. So we've got the opportunity for a great discussion today. So of course, we're going to talk about three key things. The significant supply chain challenges that really have plagued the global and New Zealand economies since the emergence of COVID-19 a couple of years ago. We're going to look at the specific problems they've generated for New Zealand business and then look forward, what can we expect and what can we do to mitigate the challenges we face. There are many of you on the call who supply chain is your bread and butter, you're living and breathing this, and your depth of knowledge is extreme, and others who really more have an interest or some niche expertise. So just then to briefly recap the three sort of categories of challenges that we're facing at the moment. The first and most acute challenge relates to sea freight. There's a huge amount of media coverage about this issue. And in brief, what really happened was an unexpected surge in global consumer spending at the outbreak of COVID-19 led to this increased demand for shipping services and equipment beyond available capacity. So on the back of that, we've seen port congestion globally, delays in shipping, cancelled sailings, container shortages, and extreme freight rates and surcharges. So that's sea freight. Then we have our air freight challenges. Now, for New Zealand, traditionally 80% of New Zealand air freight was carried in the belly hold of a passenger aircraft, and the passengers were cross-subsidising the air freight. With COVID, with planes grounded, there was limited air freight available and it was very expensive. So the government has been subsidising that air freight since March of 2020 and will continue to do so till at least March of 2023. And finally, of course, we've got land freight. They've been far less disrupted by COVID than air and sea freight, but nevertheless, the industry participants still have had to grapple with rapidly changing rules and requirements, particularly as different parts of the country have moved between COVID-19 alert levels. Hopefully, the worst of all of this is behind us for the land freight sector, but don't take my word from it. Let's hear from the panellists, who are, of course, our experts. So for the discussion today, what we'll start with is a round of initial remarks where each of our panellists, I'll introduce them and they'll speak for five or 6 minutes, looking at what are some of the key issues from their perspective, what the outlook looks like, and what potentially recommendations they may have for us. If on the back of that you've got a question bubbling up, please put it in the chat. either for everyone to see, or if you'd like to ask a particularly sensitive anonymous question, you can of course message me directly via the chat as well. I'm confident that given enough time with the group of people we have on the call today, we really could come up with a great plan to deal with our challenges, but we've only got an hour. So let's make the very most of that we can. And with that, we will move on straight to introduce our first speaker, Harriet Shelton, who's Supply Chain Manager at Ministry of Transport. For most of you who, like me, are sort of routine participants in supply chain discussions, you have not come across Harriet. She's spent a number of years in the infrastructure sector in both New Zealand and the UK, most recently being Regional Transport Manager at the Greater Wellington Regional Council. She assumed her current role at MOT 2 years ago, and her focus is really bringing together different players in the industry in order to find solutions for the instability we are currently seeing in our supply chain. So with that, Harriet, if I can hand over to you for some introductory remarks.
Thanks very much. Kia ora koutou, everybody. As Sarah's just said, I think that some of you may already have seen me before, so apologies if what I'm about to say sounds a little bit familiar. We feel like we've been on a bit of a hamster wheel really for the last 2 years, and the supply chain situation just continues to throw curveballs at us, as we are all seeing with the latest developments in Europe. That's just adding complexity to what was already a very uncertain and complex situation. And so we continue as we have always done, and with an incredibly adaptable sector. There's one thing that we have really noticed in the last 2 years is how adaptable the freight sector actually is, and how quickly they are actually able to adjust and change to all of these uncertainties and all these challenges. We have the advantage in government of coming at this from a bird's eye perspective. So we are not in the operational space, we're not at the coalface, and we rely on all of you and all of our partners in the freight sector to be able to share with us what's happening for them, what's going on for them, and what would help them to get through these challenges. We are able to at least look across the whole system rather than individual pieces of the system, see where the gaps are, and try and provide information about what's happening right across the sector. And that is one of the key things that we've been really focusing on in government over the last few months and years, is continuing to improve our monitoring and our information gathering so that we can pass it on to those of you who need it to help with your planning. It's safe to say that we're moving into a really different world, and things are probably never going to go back to the way they were. We had a long period where we were able to enjoy relatively cheap freight costs. And that was obviously a huge advantage for New Zealand, given our distance from all of our markets. We don't think, and we're certainly hearing from all of the commentary around the world and in New Zealand, is that we don't think freight prices will ever go down to the way that to the levels that they were before. And so we need to collectively work together to work out how we can adjust the way that we work as a country and as an economy to actually overcome those freight cost challenges. We also don't think that the environment that we're working in is ever going to be as predictable as it once was. There are numerous challenges and complexities that are happening around the world that have a particular high impact on New Zealand because of the smallness of our economy and where we are located. So we need to help players within the system to get better at being more agile and more responsive to those changes, rather than to be able to predict them, because we don't know that we can predict them with as much certainty as we once could. So government's role is a tricky one in this space, because a lot of this is a very dynamic market-led environment, and government doesn't do very well in dynamic market-led types of environments. What we can do is think more about those longer term settings that we can change to help the sector become more resilient and better positioned for those future shocks, because we know that there will be plenty more shocks to come. So we're starting work on a national freight and supply chain strategy. Many of you will have already heard of this, and we will be actually going out to engagement next month all going well, with an issues paper which sets out the work that we've done so far, thinking about the various challenges that we've got at the moment and also until 30 years plus into the future. And so we will be collecting, we've captured all of those views that we've received from the stakeholders that we've engaged with, and then we'll continue to engage. And so we very much welcome your involvement and participation in that process as we go forward. It's going to be a very busy year, and we would just like to be able to work in partnership with as many of the sector as we can. So that's probably, I've probably gone over my 6 minutes. I haven't been timing myself.
That's great. Thanks so much for those remarks, Harriet. Very, very insightful. Now we're going to move on to Richard Davies, who is Director of Hemisphere Freight Services Limited, which is the New Zealand arm of Hemisphere Freight Services in the UK. He has over 30 years of experience in the sector. He works for one of the largest independent providers of logistics solutions across Europe, Asia, Australasia, North America, South America, and Africa. I think that is most of the world, potentially without the exception of Antarctica. Richard has been, okay, that too. Richard has served as General Manager at Hemisphere Freight Services in the UK from 2002 until he relocated to Auckland in 2016 to establish the New Zealand operation. So Richard, if I can hand over to you.
Thanks very much indeed. I suppose I represent the bit in the middle, the bit which causes all the aggravation and problems, and the people, the consumers or the customers come to and say, where is my cargo? We represent the whole of that scenario. The problems which we face as a freight forwarder, where we act as a shield to the shipping lines and sometimes the shippers, is we don't get a chance to express where the problems are. That's already been touched on about the space issues because of the shipping lines are changing how they're doing. And also that the shipping lines, some of the shipping lines are now saying they're not even going to service freight forwarders, they just want to deal directly with commercial clients, which is a massive mistake in my opinion, but that's a conversation for a more detailed time really. We're in a perfect logistics storm. We've got Omicron hitting different places around the world, which means that depots shut down. We're experiencing massive delays in unloading cargo. It's causing massive delays at transshipment centres in Singapore, for example, or Los Angeles, where there's a backlog of, you've seen it in the papers, 70 ships waiting to berth and get unloaded. And all these incidents, and now obviously the Ukraine situation, which is terrible. And all these situations are just creating a ripple effect, which we can't keep up with, and the shipping lines can't keep up with. And there where the problems really lie is this unpredictability about what's going to happen and where the containers are going to come from. Because the world revolves in a certain way, so do containers. And because these containers are now interrupted in their journey, it creates a knock-on effect for the delays. And that's creating massive cost implications, as we've already talked about. But to give you an example of that cost, maybe a year ago from China, we were looking at a price of $2,000 US for a container. Now it's somewhere in the region of 12,000. If you to put that into perspective, your desk you're sitting at now is probably a cubic meter. That represented about $29 a cubic meter. It's now up to 180, roughly. And that doesn't include landside costs there and landside costs in New Zealand. The rising fuel costs. Fuel's gone up 4% on fuel surcharges in the last month, even with the help of the government on the taxes. All these situations are just creating a storm we can't control and we can't prepare for. And unfortunately, the understanding and the knowledge to get that across is really difficult. We don't know what impact the Ukraine effect is going to have, but it will have an impact as well. And that's just going to create even more of a scenario. We're going to have even more letdowns. So as much as I'd love to talk in more detail, and I could talk for hours about the problems in individual areas, it's not really time for now, but I am happy to talk to anybody at any time if they want to have a chat. I did just want to touch base about Brexit and the impact that's had in the UK. Contrary to popular belief, it's not really impacted New Zealand and UK trade that much because most of the stuff coming from the UK comes here. When it's in transit, it's not affected. It's only if it transits from Europe through there, something like Ireland, maybe. The impact in the UK has been massive because of the administration which has been added onto it. But really, the work between UK and New Zealand is probably in its best position administratively or logistically as it can be, with the exception of the fact it's too expensive to move stuff here and it's too slow. But that's the same across the world. We're no different. We're just facing the challenges as a small consumer group trying to work against it. I think that the real impact which we've got to accept is the fact that you're right, prices aren't going to come down in a hurry, and we've got to try and work out better ways of planning and better understanding and how we can convey that information across. I'm happy to answer any questions. I don't think there's anything else I can really add at this moment to accept that, you know, we do try and help as freight forwarders and try and smooth some of these scenarios out. But unfortunately, the consumer's going to feel the impact on their baked beans at some point, or not see the baked beans at all. So we can only try our hardest. Anyway, thanks very much indeed. If there's anyone who wants to ask you questions afterwards, by all means, feel free.
Thanks so much for those comments, Rich. And it's good to hear that at least one thing is working well, that UK and New Zealand trade. So that's great. Our next speaker, Charles Finny, will be well known to all of you with an interest in trade. So Charles has multiple different hats, but today he's wearing his hat as independent chair of the Port Company CEO Group. Many of you will also know that he is a partner at the government relations consultancy firm in Wellington, Saunders Onsworth. Charles is a former CEO of the Wellington Regional Chamber of Commerce and also a former senior official and diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So Charles, please let us know what the port sector is thinking about current supply chain challenges.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Phil, for the invitation, and Sarah for that great introduction, and welcome everybody. Maybe I begin by just re-emphasizing a point that Harriet made. Up until November 2019, New Zealand was actually really well placed to trade with the world. We had generally good international aviation and shipping links to the rest of the world, and competition between providers saw New Zealand exporters and importers enjoying extremely good freight rates to most of the world. Then COVID struck, and it struck quickly and spread fast. Initially, our focus was on what it was going to do to our China market, but it very quickly became a global problem. The original expectation was that COVID would lead to a contraction in global trade, and capacity was cut by shipping lines. That expectation failed to take account of spending habits for those locked down and the impact of government economic stimulus packages. Rather than a contraction, we've seen a marked expansion in global demand. So we've been in catch-up mode ever since. Add into the mix, there is the direct impact that COVID has had on port workers, on train drivers, truck drivers, people in warehouses and in factories, and on ships indeed. So we've had a major disruption. Freight rates have increased very significantly. Services have become less reliable. Port productivity has been impacted very significantly. And factories still have substantial backlogs, which they're trying to clear. So I would say 90% of the problems we face are global, but there are domestic issues. Ports of Auckland obviously had issues around health and safety and issues with their automation project towards the end of 2020 that exacerbated the problems. And from time to time, we've had to manage government-imposed COVID policy, which has added a layer of complexity. Probably the most direct impact in terms of trade impact was the previous government, not since Labor took full charge, but there were signs that NZ First were using COVID policy to restrict the log trade. For example, we basically had 4 weeks of no log trade. I'm really proud of the way New Zealand Inc. has worked, and Harriet, you and your colleagues have been superb to work with across government, and we've addressed each problem as it's emerged and found solutions. And I'm really proud of the port sector. Not one case of COVID made it across the maritime border to infect the New Zealand population. That took some doing. But we now face major structural problems. Inflation has gone through the roof. We have major labour market challenges looming. Many essential skills for the supply chain or wider economy just cannot be supplied domestically. And while the goods Trade and goods has survived largely intact. Some aspects of the domestic and international services economy have been very seriously impacted by what's been going on. Tourism and international education are the most obvious. And New Zealand obviously is right now in the midst of a severe Omicron infection, and this is impacting all of us across the supply chain still. Just as light was appearing on the horizon, we face two new challenges. There's already been reference several times to Ukraine. I won't labor the point, but it is impacting. The sanctions are an issue, and oil prices have gone through the roof at a time when we didn't want that to happen. Now, shipping lines have new capacity on order, and that will begin to come online by 2023. Airlines will begin flying more often to New Zealand as tourism resumes and New Zealanders travel without the spectre of MIQ deterring travel. A new normal will emerge, but it won't be like what we were dealing with in 2019. I don't expect the current disruptions to disappear this year. A brave person would say maybe sometime next year, but they're still going to be here for a while to come. And there is no guarantee that we're going to enjoy the same quality of service we enjoyed in 2019. Do not expect prices to return to 2019 levels, maybe even ever, but certainly for many years. And don't expect COVID to disappear. I reminded Harriet and some of her colleagues the other day that we began working closely together because of a COVID outbreak in China, and we were very concerned about the impact that was having on our trade with China. Well, guess what? We've got a new COVID outbreak in China, and exactly the same problems are having to be managed. The only thing I'm absolutely sure about is that the just-in-time window, which many of us operated, or just-in-time paradigm, that's out the window, and it seems that just-in-case is going to be the new way we operate for a few years to come. A global recession might help us, but that's going to have other consequences, so maybe that's not a good thing. And I go to bed every night saying, thank goodness for New Zealand's free trade agreement network, because that has helped us a lot in insulating us through the problems we've had. Very happy to take questions in due course.
Thanks so much for those comments, Charles. Now, I'm hoping, Graham, looking at you, you're wearing a bright, sunny top, so I'm hoping you've got the great news stories for us today. Graham Nelson is the General Manager of Logistics at themarket.com. So Graham joined in late 2021 as the General Manager, and of course, The Market is New Zealand's first online marketplace. Prior to joining, he held e-commerce and logistics roles at Woolworths Group in New Zealand, and he's got over 14 years of supply chain experience. Graham, would be really interested in your views as well, please.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the great introduction as well, and welcome to all the panelists and to everyone viewing as well. So when I thought about this, I thought, well, what are the short-term problems? What are the medium and what are the long-term problems? And some of the short-term problems I classify as kind of 0 to 12 months is that COVID is not over yet, and it's really only kind of just kicking in. It is not going away, and we still need to be prepared and have some good battle plans in place to help us for the future in that regard. Pinch point on transport and warehouse workers. Charles mentioned it before, the supply market for labour is short. In particular, the workforce who has skill and knowledge for domestically in warehouses, the pool is quite low. So there is a real lack of people who can head into that area, and it's not a career that many people do generally head into in supply chain. Cost increases, fuel and shipping, particularly fuel. Many of you on the call might be looking at your FAF surcharges and your invoices and making your eyes water. Those aren't going away anytime soon. So really paying attention to how you structure your FAF clause is a key enable to help remove some of the pain of that. Delays of stock, they are not going away. That is going to be compounded in my view, and the whole world is going to be ordering out of some of the manufacturing powerhouses in the world. So it would be wise to have a buffer on that to just give you enough lead time. And warehouse space. Warehouse space is quite low in New Zealand from my viewpoint. we are building our way out of it, and in particular, some of the construction for happening in the Golden Triangle, which is Tauranga, Hamilton and Auckland, but in particular, Hamilton in the future will become a super freight hub and logistical centre of the country. We will build ourselves out of that, but at the moment, if you are looking for warehouse space to hold more stock for peak, it's better to start now than in August. Some of the medium-term problems about 1 to 3 years, you know, I don't think it's going to come right until 2024, and then the prices won't go down. We'll just be experiencing what it is now, and that will be fueled by inflation, and we'll get used to those prices. Tech resource. Tech is becoming more and more of a component to supply chain. You know, I've been specialising in e-commerce for the last 5 years, running Countdown Online and in an operational and logistical sense, and now into the warehouse group. Tech is a huge enablement for that. E-commerce penetration into businesses has been fueled by COVID. People wanting to shop from home, and it has become far more of a comfort, and it's more convenient. So tech is the enablement for that, for the future of your business. And tech and getting the connections between all the businesses that will take for you to enable that takes time. So you need to pre-plan that, and tech resource is short. We're not producing enough graduates in the market for that. And inventory building. You know, the key problem is if you're holding more stock, you need to wrap around some great inventory practices, because you could quickly find yourself into a hole if you're not turning off stock, if you're not selling stock through quick enough. With more inventories, we'll put more pressure on warehouse space, as well as businesses look to become more resilient and not be solely reliant on overseas. And long term, kind of 3 to 5 years, it's one that I believe is a problem into the future, and that's a lack of young talent coming into supply chain. There's not enough people seeing supply chain as a career in the operational components, and it's a thing that I really try to help enable. So if you do have young people within your business, and you do have grand expansion plans, look to put a career development plan in place for those people, and enable them into the future. And you know, what is working, because it's not all doom and gloom, right? Like, it's not. You know, COVID has enabled some great things. We've had a rapid evolution of systems to support e-com penetration. So businesses are reacting well to that. Some businesses are evolving, but some are kind of resting on their laurels. So which one of those camps do you fit into? And businesses are really starting to understand the importance of supply chains. Lo and behold, you know, the supply chain didn't maybe have a big enough voice at the boardroom table, or in the strategy sessions. It always did, but more so, I think businesses have realized over the last couple of years how important the supply chains are to the business, and they are now stress testing their supply chains for the future, and really relying on us more than ever before. Some of the other ideas to help with some of these short and medium and long-term problems, you know, cross-training of team, really making sure that you have a good cross-functional matrix for your team, and all the different components of your supply chain. It sounds simple, but actually not only trusting that it's there, but verifying it, that's critical, because, you know, a lot of the DCs around the country are suffering from anywhere up 25 up to, I've even heard of 45% of absenteeism at some of the DCs domestically. And do you have enough people to cover and make sure things are going out? Could you quickly get an extra 100 people into your DC, all trained, all ready to go? Double down on partnership operation. So moving away from the customer supplier narrative and more working hand in hand with your supplier or your customer. So really building the bond between yourselves over the next couple of years, because it has been hard and it is still going to be hard into the future. So, you know, one of the questions I like asking to our suppliers is, what can I do to help you be more profitable? What can I actually do to make your business more efficient, which will then give a better result for the customers? So flipping the equation on the head and becoming, I guess, more balanced and hand-in-hand partnership. Really focus on your inventory. That's a short-term thing that you can do now for your warehouses. Automation is now the time. The prices will continue to decrease as more and more competition enters the market for automation. And the cost of labour will increase into the future as well. And there will become a perfect point for many businesses where the intersection might occur. And automation has its benefits, and you can look to see what's happening in the worldwide markets and suppliers on what's happening there. Another key one, and then I'll probably finish there because I could talk about this for hours, as some of the other people said, and I'm sure there's a few questions, but one of the key things that supply chain people are good at is they're problem solvers. They are given a problem, they bounce it around, and then they work it out. And to do that, you need to take your key people or your smartest people in the room who are leading your supply chain operation, and you need to take them out of the weeds. And you need them to look above the parapet and get that 50,000-foot view to start future-proofing and stress testing your supply chain. And on top of that, you should be looking to different scenarios through. And, you know, I quite regularly have done that in all facets of my experiences, where you'll call a meeting and then you'll put up random scenarios on the board about how the team would look to solve that. And you know, going through on absenteeism and what COVID 2.0 will look like, and what happens if there's an earthquake, what's going to happen. Having those questions front and center of mind, you will get the best out of your supply chain network. I think that's kind of it, and I'll pass it on back to you.
Thanks so much for those introductory remarks, Graham, and in particular the practical advice, which I think is really helpful for people at a time like this. We've got some good questions coming through on the chat, but I think I might start with a big picture question based on the comments that you've all made. I think we've got a consistent theme here, that we're seeing that we have very acute problems that are likely to last for at least the short and the medium term, that many of those problems are not of our own making. And so potentially maybe there isn't so much we can do. Maybe we just need to be aware of the situation we're in and ride that storm. We have the government, as Harriet said, publishing a strategy issues paper next month, trying to look at ways where the government might be able to intervene. And that paper seems to have potentially a 30-year horizon that it's looking across. But of course, as I said, we've got these short, medium-term acute problems that we need to deal with. So I've got a question for all of our panelists, if I can, just to ask, what do you think is the number one most useful thing the government could do right now in order to assist participants in the supply chain to better cope with these short and medium term challenges they face? Who would like to start with that one? Charles.
Immigration policy. We are going to desperately need to import skills from offshore, and currently immigration policy settings are standing in our way.
I'll just add to that, actually, if you don't mind, guys. You're absolutely right, Charles. Funny enough, when we moved over here with our immigration, one of the things which became apparent is that logistics isn't seen as a skilled labour set by New Zealand government, and it's not what they considered an essential service prior to COVID. So by looking at what they consider to be skilled services, that might make a massive difference. So I completely agree with Charles.
I'll go next. Yeah, I agree. I think having some more labour come into the market will help us get through this. It means we'll be able to turn over more cartons and get products to shelves quicker, whatever that format may be. There is one other aspect that I think could immediately help into the container aspect, and that is having more boots on the ground in an MPI format to actually check off containers and process that faster for businesses, so we're not facing so much detention costs, and really helping out our horticulture and importing aspect as well. I believe that would make an immediate impact straight away. And echoing Charles and Richard, you know, supply chain isn't seen as a go-to career on the skilled labour list. So having that, and then also helping encourage young people into the industry will help to future-proof us for when we get out of this eventually. And we should be encouraging more and more people into supply chain degrees or formats for education.
Well, I'll deliberately go last because I am government, and I think you've all hit the nail on the head. The immigration question is certainly something that comes to us time and time again, and we've provided support for a number of parts of the sector in their overcoming their immigration challenges. What I probably would say is, if it was the number one thing, and it's really interesting that it's sort of echoed what you've all said, is that getting out of the way is actually one of the best things that government can do right now. Some of those other things, like boosting the attractiveness of the industry to encourage more people to join, absolutely, that's a key part of our strategy, but that will take longer. And so right now, the best thing I think that we can do, and what we've been trying to do, is to get out of your way so that you can continue doing business as best you can. Within reason, of course.
That's a really interesting question, which leads beautifully into an anonymous question we've got in the chat here, which was really asking about what are the governments and other public incentives that might encourage international logistics developers to come to New Zealand and help solve some of our issues like lack of warehousing and storage space. So Harriet, you've suggested here that potentially this is not bread and butter work for the government. Perhaps it's private sector that could be enticing these logistics developers here. Perhaps, Richard, maybe as a logistics company that's recently come here, potentially you could talk about what might make it attractive for you, and potentially, I don't know if you want to entice competition to the market, but how could we be going about attracting more providers and developers to New Zealand?
Well, I just want to go back and touch on a point. I think about saying, making logistics sexier. I'm here. What do I kind of say? Look, I think we've been trying to break and open a market a lot more, and really, it's about the incentives of understanding what goes on down here, where the buildings are, and getting support from to get maybe not even tax incentives, but just making it easier for businesses to operate and open in New Zealand. I don't think it's difficult to entice businesses, but I think it's difficult to entice the right businesses. I don't necessarily know the answer. We want to invest in New Zealand. We're trying to invest in New Zealand, but some of the regulations and rules are a little bit antiquated and need to be looked at to help us do that, really. And then more support in the outlaying cost for warehousing, as Graham was talking about, is huge. And the return isn't instantaneous, and we need more support up front to try and help us to deal with that cost. I think that would be my answer.
We've got a couple of good questions here. The first one is about sustainability, and this question of how much is sustainability still a key feature in the thinking of key players in the global supply chain, given current challenges. I think particularly the question might refer to now we have record high prices for fuel. Again, does this help people want to move to more sustainable types of freight movements? Has anyone got some thoughts on sustainability and how important that is to this industry participants? Charles.
Because of time, I didn't raise this issue, but thinking back to what was on the agenda for my dialogues with people like Harriet in 2019, sustainability and climate change response were very high on the list. Indeed, one of the issues that we were dealing with was New Zealand's accession to a International Maritime Organization treaty that was going to regulate the sulfur level in fuels that could be used in the shipping industry, and we were managing concerns about cost increases that would flow and what we would do to residues should people just be taking it out of this emission system. Those issues haven't gone away. They're just unfortunately, we're spending most of our time on COVID response as opposed to climate change response. But that and what we're seeing with fuel increases will, I think, exacerbate trends that were already apparent. See the international shipping industry move quickly to explore and eventually adopt new means by which you power vessels so that they are more sustainable. I think we're already seeing it in New Zealand. Here in Wellington, we've got an electric ferry, and there are several other proposals for short distance electric based shipping solutions. It's very similar to what we're seeing in the land freight side. Unfortunately, electric vehicles are not the solution when you're dealing with very heavy loads at present. So watch the space with regard to hydrogen cell technology. That is something that the shipping industry has been looking at very carefully. So this is a very important theme in terms of on port movement towards electric vehicles. Hydrogen are very much things that are being researched and being introduced. Auckland is probably the most obvious case, but what's happening in Auckland is being looked at and being mirrored across the country. So it's a very important issue. We just don't talk about it as much right now as we probably should be, because there are other things that are more immediately front of mind. But it is something that is very real, and the industry is working towards becoming more sustainable all the time.
Graham.
Yeah, just echoing some of the comments there. I see sustainability as a big factor into the future when you're looking at a 5 to 10, and it's been driven by the consumer and also with the government as well. But the consumer, particularly the younger generation, is really helping to drive this into what they're choosing to spend their money on. And you'll hear a term starting to come up more and more called green logistics or eco-logistics. And this will be a new arm within the supply chain avenue, where businesses go all out to have a zero carbon format. There's a number of tools that can help do that. Better packaging on how that's can reduce waste, and there's a lot of companies in New Zealand who are heading towards that in the packaging space. Obviously hydrogen for large heavy fuel vehicles, which was mentioned before, and I believe there's already some exciting opportunity with something that might be happening down into the South Island. Electric vehicles for parcel will become, and kind of grocery kind of aspects will become more and more. I had previous success landing electric vehicles into the network in a prior role, and they do work. But it's, it is going to be a more and more front of mind thing for supply chain and businesses on how they can reduce cost on it into the future. And it's quite an exciting avenue. And I believe the way it will be solved, it will be driven by the customer, but to solve it is not just business, it's not government, but also academia as well. And the perfect triangle can actually form for some of those results. And I've worked quite closely with Auckland University on a number of aspects, and they hold a lot of wealth and information, and so do the government with backing and legislative law change, and the businesses who actually just get stuck in and get it done. So that's how I think it will be solved into the future, driven by the consumer.
Thanks, Graham. We've got two great questions here. One of them relates to probably one of the primary topics of today, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, it's been hugely disruptive to international sea freight and air freight. So we have a lot of Western countries which have completely closed their airspace to planes from Russia. We have a number of the sea freight carriers, Maersk and others, who won't stop in Russia or take new orders to Russia anymore, and DHL won't be delivering your customs documentation. So I guess this is really a question for Richard. Richard, how has the international freight industry managed all the disruption relating to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Done what we normally do, put a head in the sand. unfortunately, it's not necessarily untrue. It's too early to say the impacts. And if I started saying what I think it would be or how it's going to be, I'd be lying, because I don't think anyone knows at this stage. It's been 3 weeks or however it's been. And I think really the biggest concern really is what's going on full stop, let alone the shipping aspects of it is minimal really, compared to what's actually happening there. Russians and Ukrainians are probably suffering as individuals. So I don't think I'm in a position to really say. I'm not the shipping lines. You know, that being said, how much impact does it necessarily really have on us? Probably not as big as you probably think. If in some ways it'll probably speed up the loops. Shipping lines don't go to one port and then come back and go back and forth. They go to several ports. So it'll just be one stop en route. The problem is the containers will all be on there, and it's just going to create a delay because the ship's planners have got a rotation. And one of the problems we haven't talked about, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's not the most interesting thing. Charles will probably know this better than the rest, but the problem we really have is ships plan their vessels like bus stops, and they load the containers like bus stops. And if all of a sudden you miss a port out, which gets emissions on ports at the moment is not just because of Russia, it's also because there's congestion at the ports and the shipping lines just say we're going somewhere else. And the problem then goes when it gets to the next port, to get to its containers, it's got to pull everybody else's containers off and then put them all back on again. So whereas we were looking at turnaround of 24 hours, it's a lot longer now. How's Russia going to impact us? We don't know yet. It's just going to cause more delays and add to the storm which we're already in.
I've got an interesting suggestion here from Warren Head at the New Zealand Shipping Gazette, and I think this question is really for Harriet. It relates to whether New Zealand should be creating free trade zones. This is very dear to my heart. I used to lecture a Masters of Law course on free trade zones. So Harriet, I'd be really interested to hear from you whether the idea of creating free trade zones, which is sort of specific little geographic areas where you're really focused on simplifying import-export, potentially some special tax rules apply. Harriet, is that free trade zones, is that something that the New Zealand government might consider as part of its strategy?
We are probably not going to be tackling those precise aspects. They're probably something that's more for the likes of MFAT and possibly the New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, although we work very closely with them. One of the things that we are doing at the moment, just in our capacity as a transport ministry, is exploring partnerships with Australia and Singapore and various other Asia Pacific partnerships and anywhere else really where we can get into, where we can actually share best practice and set up perhaps harmonisation of some of the way that we collect and manage data, and work together on putting forward our respective countries' positions on in forums like the International Maritime Organization and so on. So it's really more of a, from our perspective, that's what we're mostly interested in, is exploring those things where we can together develop those partnerships that enable us to think about how we can improve or standardize the way that trade is actually occurring. But yeah, the actual free trade settings are probably not our wheelhouse.
Can I just add a little something to that, if you don't mind, guys?
Yes, please do.
It's funny, really, because Hemisphere in the UK has just started getting quite into the free port scenario, as it's called, and it works very beneficially there because it's a transit area. One of the things I don't understand, and it's just to generalise that question, one of the things we have in the UK, which we don't have here, and I find it slightly odd, the free ports I don't think are necessarily the right way for us to go, because we're the end of a chain. We're not in the middle of a chain, which is where free ports really do work. But we don't have a bonded situation. And wouldn't that be quite helpful to commercial importers? Say a market, they've got warehousing here, but when they bring it into New Zealand, they've immediately got to pay the GST on it. In the UK, we have bonded warehouses. You can bring all your cargo in, you can hold it, and you don't pay your GST on it until such time as they release it out for sale and it gets sold in batches or individually, as it may be. And maybe that's something which would actually help commercial businesses, and something which could be discussed more openly here. I don't know who the best people are to speak about it, and I'm not the expert, but surely that would help someone like Graham's business, where they could hold their cargo, or Bunnings or Mitre 10. They could hold more cargo here and not have the implications of paying the tax until it's really needed. At the moment, they have to pay the tax as soon as it lands.
I think that's a really interesting suggestion, Richard, and I'm interested in the comment you make that New Zealand's not in the centre of the world, because obviously many of us on the call thought that it was. But there has been discussion in the last few years in New Zealand about making New Zealand a bit of a hub between Asia and Latin America, as sort of the project known as the Southern Link, and the thought that we could actually establish some kind of warehousing sort of tax incentives to enable New Zealand to be sort of a storage depot for products coming from Asia going to South America. I know Charles and probably Harriet, both of you have probably had some involvement in the Southern Link project. I'd just be interested in your thoughts as to what extent, if at all, you think the Southern Link, if we were to implement that, might solve any of our problems.
I have only had very peripheral involvement, and I think the conversations about it have been very positive, but we are still really in the hands of the decisions that are made by those private operators, whether they want to actually do this or not, and whether New Zealand remains an attractive destination as part of that link. There are probably things that we could do to improve the infrastructure within the New Zealand port system and other parts of the freight system to make the journey worthwhile for these lines, because even if it looks like it's on the path between the likes of Latin America and Asia, it's still a bit of a detour for a lot of these lines. I don't know, Charles, if you've got other thoughts.
I certainly have in the past seen the Southern Link as being really powerful as a concept when it comes to people-to-people travel and linkages, because for many places in Asia, the quick way to get to Latin America is actually through Auckland and or somewhere in New Zealand, and we should be somehow leveraging that more. We do already have some significant shipping linkages that are sort of originating in Latin America and going up to Asia and vice versa. And one thing that is haven't talked about, but one of the responses to the current challenges has been a revival of interest in break bulk. It was sort of a skill set that had disappeared apart from for kiwi fruit, and it's been revived, and now a number of exporters are using it. And what we're seeing is the backfilling of these services. So product goes up to say Japan or Taiwan, and the ship comes back and picks up some bananas or something in the Philippines and drops it back. And we're seeing that with North America and Latin America, and there's sort of this new interesting new service product going up into Los Angeles or Seattle, and the ship coming back via Latin America and picking up product and bringing it to New Zealand. So maybe it is opening new opportunities there. I think that this is something we should be definitely talking about. Not quite sure where it would end and what the real opportunity is. So appealing concept. We really need to do hard work on exactly whether there is the opportunity that some see. And unfortunately, it's sort of caught up a little bit with China and the Belt and Road thing, which is perhaps not politically flavour of the month right now. So we want to sort of distance it from that a little bit, I guess. I don't think I can say much more at this point.
The mention, Charles, of break bulk makes me think about coastal shipping. Random segue. Harriet, obviously the government announced earlier this year that it would be putting $30 million into developing New Zealand's coastal shipping network, and there was a hope that that might alleviate some pressure domestically, both both on sort of on the sea freight front, but also on the land freight front. Are you able to give us an update, please, on what's happened with the coastal shipping workstream?
With regards to the coastal shipping activity class within the National Land Transport Fund, lots of jargon there. This is the fund that you're referring to, which is managed by Waka Kotahi, the New Zealand Transport Agency, and they've just put out an RFP actually for proposals to be submitted for that class, the use of those activity class funds, and that'll be announced. The recipients of that funding will be announced. I think it's July, sort of around the middle of the year. The intention of that fund is to boost the coastal shipping sector, the domestic shipping sector, both from a decarbonisation perspective and also a maritime sector boost perspective. But 30 million isn't really a huge sum of money, so it is really it's a signal from the government that this is a sector that is considered important to New Zealand for lots of different reasons. But it's really the beginning of what we hope will be a much more sort of long-term strategy for the coastal shipping sector. This initial fund is really just it will probably, it's not going to be transformative, put it that way. I think, you know, we'll probably get some great proposals that will come through this, but it won't be enough on its own. And so the ministers asked us for advice on a regular basis as to what we can do in that space. Once again, it seems to always come down to the long-term nature of the issue, that ultimately we want to have a much more vibrant and stronger maritime sector in New Zealand. When we're a maritime nation with a proud history, both from Māori, Pacific and Pakeha traditions. And so it's only right that we should have a really, really strong shipping sector. At the moment, we have 13 New Zealand flagged ships, I think it is, or 12, soon to become 2 less, with the coastal tankers potentially not operating when the Marsden Point refinery closes. So we need to really think about what we can do to enable that sector to grow, but while also not increasing costs to consumers. The price of increased domestic shipping is going to be higher than international shipping for lots of reasons. And so how do we actually ensure that we have that resilience that we can get from having that coastal shipping sector, but also not making it prohibitive for the transport of freight around New Zealand by New Zealand flagged vessels? It's actually quite a complicated space, and there are some legislative changes that would probably be required that will take some time. But rest assured, we are definitely working on it, and there are quite a lot of different things that we could do, whether that's investing in infrastructure at ports, whether that's looking at the possibility of a dry dock in Northport, which of course has been talked about on and off over the years, or whether that's something to do with the conditions for seafarers. There's all kinds of things that we'll be tackling over the next few months and years.
Thanks so much for the update, Harriet. I'm conscious of time. I have one quick point and one final quick question. A point well made from Simon Beale at Turners and Growers, who points out on coastal shipping that in all of these complex discussions that we need to have, it's important, of course, not just to look at policy officials' views and the views of freight providers, etc. It's really critical to also involve the cargo owners in those discussions. A final question from Graham Jackson, and potentially I can challenge our panelists to give a 1 or 2 word answer. He's wondering if we're starting to see collaborations occurring, private sector collaborations between importers, exporters and organisations to try and increase efficiency in logistics. So I imagine this is where we're seeing collaborations where people club together to charter ships, for example. But maybe he's asking for some main examples of collaborations. In 1 or 2 words, can anyone give us some good examples of collaboration?
Well, Charles does.
Yeah, look, no, I think that you actually already hit the nail on the head there, and you mentioned Simon Beale just before. What Turners and Growers and others are doing around the break bulk exports and imports is a very good example of how the market is responding really fast to a real challenge and coming up with a workable solution. So you can have 3 or 4 exporters collaborating on one of these ships, and it seems to be working quite well.
Thanks, Charles. I'm conscious, everyone, that we're out of time and no one likes to be kept after the school bell rings. So thank you so much, panelists and audience, for joining us today. Phil, maybe I'll briefly hand over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks very much. And thanks very much to the panelists. Very informative. I've learned a lot, certainly. Trying to understand more about the challenges. And I think, interestingly, more about the possible solutions, because I think the one thing that came through was that, or one of the many things that came through was, these are problems that are going to continue for a long while. And I think right at the start, Harriet made that comment, probably, which was echoed by everybody: things will not go back to the way they were. So I think that's very important. And I think people have to, as Harriet said, adapt and learn to adapt and need help with adapting. So I think that's probably the themes that I picked up, that I suspect if we reconvene this panel in 6 months' time, there'll be a different set of challenges, but some of the same things will also come up, and some of the, we'll still be talking about how we find solutions, and we just have to keep working at it. I think it's one of those things that won't go away. We have to work at. So thank you very much to all our panelists for their expert knowledge and wisdom. Thank you very much to Sarah for moderating this. I know that's a very difficult job. And I will give a plug for a podcast or an interview you did recently with Radio New Zealand, Sarah, on the sanctions that the New Zealand government have put in place with Russia. I think that's very worthwhile to listen to that if you have any business in that part of the world. Bearing in mind the horrific stuff that's going on there, understanding that and the implications for businesses and individuals is very important. So I recommend that. I'm sure it's on Minter Ellison's LinkedIn page, it's certainly on ours. So that'd be worth listening to. We did record this event, so we will put it out on our website, and we will put it in our social media if you want to revisit the wisdom that was imparted, if you have more thoughts about it. While you're on the website, it would be remiss not to go to our membership section and not click on how to become a member. We are going to be planning more events like this, obviously, on different aspects of trade throughout the year. I do hope at some stage, and I'm confident at some stage in the near future, they will be in person rather than us all on a Zoom call. And I think that'll be a major development for all of us, makes it a lot easier. But as I say, for the moment, whether we see you in person or online at future events, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you again to our panelists and Sarah. Thank you everyone for participating, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.